Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Justworks' fifth installment of the Ask an Expert series, How Can Small Businesses Modify Their Workplaces to Facilitate a Safe Return to Work? My name is Moses Balian. I'm a certified HR consultant at Justworks, and joining me today is our expert, Kara Yates. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kara.
Thank you, Moses. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kara Yates, and I'm a Society for Human Resources Management, or SHRM, certified professional with a background in small to medium-sized business HR management. I'm currently a consultant working with Justworks HR consulting team. Our team is designed to help Justworks customers with an in-depth dive into HR employment best practices. I'm excited to be sharing my knowledge with you guys today.
And we are so excited to benefit from it, Kara. Thank you so much. So for those who are new to the Ask an Expert webinar series, the first half of today's webinar is going to be a presentation delivered by Kara as to today's topics. Then the whole second half of the webinar will deal with a Q&A. So we'll be fielding questions from our registrants and attendees. Also, please keep in mind that following this webinar, we will send out an email with tons of resources, a blog post, links to federal, state, and local regulations with respect to returning to the physical workplace, and also a recording of today's webinar. So please keep an eye out for that. Moving on, I just need to touch on our standard disclaimer, which is of the utmost importance that this material has been prepared for informational purposes and shall not be construed as legal or tax advice. I also want to briefly touch on what we will and won't cover. What we will is office space considerations, physical modifications for the new workplace, policy considerations that complement those physical alterations, and then potential procedural obstacles you might face along the way. What we're not going to get into is the nitty-gritty and super specific regulatory and compliance landscape around what might be legally required of you as an office, just because it's such a patchwork of laws and regulations. So with that, Kara, I'm really eager to start. Obviously, COVID-19 has wrought tremendous challenges for businesses, individuals who run businesses. And the challenges continue to arise. Sort of now on the threshold of our doorstep is this return to work and everything, all these conversations had surrounding that. So with that, step one, physical working environment modifications. I know when you and I were putting together some of the material for this, we thought about it from like the employee experience perspective. So with that, let's start with front of office, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so when returning to work, the front of office might be that first step for your employee, right? So as an employer, it's really important to consider who's going to be in your front office area. Generally this area is reserved for your reception or maybe a security person, but now this area might be your staging area for temperature checks or symptom screening, or just to check employees in as they come in because you have a limited staff. So it's really important to kind of figure out who's going to be in this office first, and then from there you can begin to figure out what this front of office is going to be, how it's going to be set up.
Who's going to be in the office at all, right? Like who's even going to be coming in?
Yeah, exactly. So, you may not need that receptionist person, or if there's anybody who does sit there, you may not need them, but you may need somebody there to perform those temperature checks if they exist, right? Or if there's symptom screening. So you might even consider adding a desk for that HR person, or someone in leadership who's the designated person to handle that. So, the next thing to consider in your front office is kind of that setup and how are you going to have temperature check areas right when the employee walks in, or are you going to have it closer to the front doors? As your employee walks in, it's important to also let them know like what's going on.
Totally. And this might involve, I've heard it can involve two things, or two of both, is temperature checks and then like symptom screenings, which will probably take the form of a questionnaire. One thing, this is a great opportunity for me to bring up, we actually have another Ask an Expert webinar presentation tomorrow where we're hosting Justworks' valued partner, One Medical, where we'll be talking about some of the mechanisms that will facilitate the return to work. So be sure to tune into that. Check out our events page. So sorry to steal the stage, Kara, please.
That's actually a good transition into, the notes that I want to make here on temperature checks too, while I'm not going into it in depth. Part of the office setup here is to consider, having a spot for isolated employees. Say somebody comes into your office and might have a higher temperature or isn't feeling well. The general best practice here is to isolate that employee and consider sending them home, but you need to get them away from the general population at that point. So that's part of the new setup that you should consider. And moving into temperature checks as well, if you are going to collect any data on your temperature checks, it's really important to consider, that information is medical in nature, and it could be viewed as medical records, right?
I was going to say, as an HR practitioner myself, my spidey senses started tingling thinking about temperature checks. So it sounds a lot like protected health information to me.
Yeah, exactly. So, while there's no requirement to, gather this information, if you do, just keep in mind that it is confidential and it should be kept in a designated area where that's locked off. Only certain employees can access that information, such as your HR manager or office manager. And it should be kept in records similar to leave of absence paperwork or FMLA paperwork if your company is covered under the FMLA.
Right. So an HR department's record keeping procedure might already have the perfect place for this documentation. Just need to make sure it's in good company along with that other sensitive medical or medical adjacent information.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, great. As we continue on our journey of the way employees might experience this return to work, let's say we got to reception, we got our temperature checked, did our symptom screening. I'm in. Now what is my reality going to be and how will it have changed?
Yeah, so, once an employee walks through the front office area and, they head over to their desk, which is where they're going to be for most of the day, employers need to consider what that new desk area is going to look like. It's important to kind of consider, if employees are going to be required to wear masks, during the day and while they're sitting at their desks. Some jobs may not require mask wearing or PPE, which is personal protective equipment, which is regulated in some industries. So if you're in, potentially a medical type role or something, you may have to wear PPE. So you need to really consider that, that factor. The other thing to consider here is desk separation. As most of us have heard by now, 6 feet apart is kind of the rule of thumb, for social distancing. However, when you're looking at your new office space, you have to really consider how you're going to separate desks. For instance, if you have pods of employees, so if you have employees sitting in groups, it could be 5 to 10 people, you can, if you're not able to separate those pods completely, you can always have employees sit in different directions facing separate ways as a solution to that. But again, rule of thumb, 6 feet apart, social distancing, keep those desks apart.
Kara, it's funny because, you and I are teammates, and when we were still in the office, we used to sit diagonally across from each other and used to speak across that all the time. That probably wouldn't be the reality of things anymore. Maybe back to back, 6 feet apart, but it's a little melancholy to think of that dynamic going away.
A little bit, yeah.
Well, great. We talked about desk separation, keeping your office space clean. So I've always been a fan of hand sanitizer long before this happened. That was a staple at my desk, but I imagine that's going to be of even greater importance now and one of many things to consider.
Yeah, for sure. So, in the past, it wasn't always commonplace for employees to have cleaning supplies on their desks. However, now that may be a very real piece of the employee's experience now. The cleaning supplies that you should provide to your employees, whether it be, maybe one per pod or one for every employee, really should be, such as Lysol wipes or something like that. But anything that, the CDC suggests that you have EPA regulated cleaning supplies that kill viruses and bacteria. Hand sanitizer should be at least 60% alcohol, and employees can have that at their workstations, obviously, because they may not be able to go wash their hands anytime they accidentally touch their face or touch a surface and they're not ready for it. So it's definitely a good idea to have some hand sanitizer available and cleaning supplies.
Definitely. And, you know, we were joking before, I'm actually not crazy about this image, how close that woman's finger is getting to her colleague's screen. Even if the distancing seems okay-ish, but yeah, we should be conscious of like everywhere we're placing our hands, right? I'm thinking like printers is probably the most commonly used thing that I touch in the office. Yeah, just being aware of that cross-contamination. Great. Well, okay, let's look a little bit more at like floor plans and modifying the layouts of physical office environments.
Yeah, so some of the other areas that, people may not always think about are things like your aisleways and meeting rooms, break rooms, kitchen areas. There are a lot of guidelines on these particular areas as well. So, for instance, your aisleways, they can be set as like one direction type aisleways. So this is drawn so people are not intermixing, they're not crossing each other. This is also so that way people sitting in those aisleways are not getting air from both directions. Some industries are considering also floor markings to indicate pathways and or seating positions for those aisleways. So it does help with reducing that intermixing of employees. The other thing to consider here are meeting rooms. Their meeting rooms vary in size. You have some that may be 4 people, some that are 15 people, but each meeting room should be adjusted to meet the needs of social distancing and your business. So, a good example that we talked about earlier is that there's a company out there that is taking like dots and putting them on seats and where employees are allowed to sit. In these meeting rooms too, is like you should also provide any kind of cleaning supplies, for employees if they go in there as well.
Sure, and we might expect that conference rooms that used to accommodate 6 or 8 people will now realistically be more like 2.
Yeah, exactly. And also here with meeting rooms, we still have access to Zoom and, all of our video equipment too. So if you don't have essential meetings, or if you do have a meeting room per se, or somebody using that meeting room, it's important to have only essential employees in that meeting at that time.
Absolutely. And you can still video conference in your colleagues. So yeah, it's great that we have the technology to leverage that. One thing I wanted to highlight that you look in this sample floor plan, it appears that there's sort of a movable desks and maybe that they actually can't be physically separated. They're not independently operating. So if we can't space, do we have other alternatives?
If you're not able to space, there are alternatives such as like setting up cubicles in your office, that might come as a cost or something like that. But what you've seen maybe in grocery stores or something like that are those plastic barriers.
Right.
They might be pretty easy to install and pretty quickly instead of, changing all of your furniture. So having some sort of barrier between employees if you're not able to fully meet the social distancing guidelines, that's not a terrible idea either.
That's huge. Okay, great. Well, what about non-work common spaces like kitchens, lounges? How's that reality going to change?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the EEOC is recommending to restrict access completely to kitchen and break rooms. This is because those are areas where a lot of people congregate and touch things, touch surfaces, and it may not be easy to clean after themselves as they touch those surfaces, as well as cups coming in and out, things like that, where things were touching somebody's face or something like that would be contaminating that area. So the EOC is saying restrict access completely or as much as possible. Until further notice, that would be best practice, is to follow that guideline. Bathrooms, I would still consider having social distancing requirements in place, a limited number of people in the bathroom at the same time. You could set this up like having a line outside the door, like you see in the grocery store with the separate lines.
Nice. Great. So we talked about modifying, what do I have to shuffle around What are the new realities of my physical environment going to be? So with that is the required warranted complement of policy language that sets the precedence for all these things, and then also, very importantly, influences employee behavior and decorum. So let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. So the CDC has, or sorry, OSHA has actually noted that specific roles in your company may be designated as high, medium, or low exposure to COVID-19. So it's a good idea to kind of develop your policies based on those types of levels. So high would be anybody who's directed, like who would be generally working with COVID patients directly. Somebody who's medium risk level, it would be, a retail employee with, constant traffic in and out of the business. And low would just be general office employees where there's not a lot of intermixing. So you can kind of develop your policies based on that. So first, it's important to kind of develop your company policy on PPE or masks. Keep in mind here that PPE is regulated in some industries, so it's a good idea to check if you fit into that. Otherwise, masks, at your desk and common spaces, those can be put into a policy, so employees are very understanding of what you're requiring there. Your cleaning procedures can be placed into a policy as well, making sure that your employees are following all of your guidelines, as well as social distancing requirements and, of course, the number of employees in your office at any given time. Also note here that this may be set by the state. Some states like New York specifically have mandated that no more than 50% in phase 2 can be in the office at any given time. But your policy can be more restricted. So you might be in phase 2, but you still only want 20% in the office at any given time. So just keep that in mind, that there are some state standards on the number of employees.
Great. Should always
yeah.
review your return to work plan with counsel for sure.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. And also, before you start returning to work, it's really important to consider your training and communication strategy with your employees. It's a good idea to make sure that your employees have an understanding of what's going on before they enter the office. Even if you just communicate what the policy is and then do some training in the office to show the areas, and again, some states have mandated this in their return to work guidelines. And
100%.
I
can't emphasize enough the difference. Sorry, the difference between like making these physical modifications and then reinforcing and training employees on behavior. You can set hand sanitizer on every surface in the office, but if employees don't understand exactly how they're supposed to use it and how they're supposed to comport themselves, then it doesn't take you all the way there.
Exactly. And last but not least, the other consideration I want to note here is, if you're in a building with communal spaces between offices, it's really important that you navigate your policies with the building policies. For instance, if you have an employee, if you share an elevator, what is your building policy on that? And, are your employees supposed to follow that policy? It's really important that you navigate that information. And some buildings might share bathrooms with, some offices might share bathrooms or break areas. It's important to take that information from your building and build upon that.
Right. Not every office is each individual employer cordoned off from the others, but might share a lot of common spaces. The extreme being like a co-working space, right? Where almost everything is shared except workstations. So it's really important to be in dialogue with your building.
Yes.
Great. So can't talk about hand washing enough. Hand washing is the new thing. All the kids are doing it. What should we be aware of and for informing employees?
Yeah. So, I know we've all heard about hand washing and, it's a topic of discussion. But, first, when you're developing your policies in your office, you should look at this as a hygiene policy and how you really expect your employees to, wash their hands, but also, keep up the general safety standards in your office. first, you would want to review the CDC guidelines on the hand washing, and this information can be posted around your office too as reminders. But basically, how germs spread, key times to wash, how to wash, and when to use the hand sanitizer instead of soap and water if that's the only thing available. Again, you can post all of this information up in your office, particularly in kitchen areas and around doors and in the bathroom. Remind your employees that this is expected of them. And the difficult part of this is being prepared to have proper hygiene discussions with employees. Any conversation you have an employee with about hygiene or washing their hands or something that might be a little uncomfortable, should reinforce the importance of hand washing, the health of safety for themselves and for others. And also set your expectations going forward. That's really important here too. What will happen if they continue to disobey the rules and not follow what the guidance is there.
And I know we perpetually ask a lot of managers, but managers are compelled to be the champions of a culture of compliance with respect to hygiene procedures.
Yeah, so going back to training, it's very important that not only is your staff trained on this information, but also make sure your managers know what's expected of them and train them on the next steps for these types of discussions. And of course, just HR best practice here is to always document conversations and, for any record keeping purposes and things like that.
Document. Yep,
as we always say.
I'm so excited to get to our Q&A, Kara. You are a wealth of knowledge. So I just want to summarize the points of our presentation, your presentation today. Two halves, really. The physical working environment modifications, which will include the biggies, will be front of office considerations, temperature and symptom checks, and just what that whole layout's going to look like. PPE for employees have to be aware of your industry standards as well as the state and local regulatory requirements for what might be demanded of you. And then beyond that, whether you will go above and beyond as far as requirements for your office policies. And then spacing and planning, maintaining social distance, whether it's one-way walkways, reducing conference room capacity, separating desks, putting up partitions, lots to consider. And then the second half is policy and procedure, getting all these things written down and codified and delivered in a way that employees know how to behave in the new office environment and how to interact with the physical world surrounding them. Did I miss anything?
I think you covered it.
Okay, cool. Great. Well, I'm so excited to jump into some questions. We've already got some great ones. I'm going to bring the screen sharing down. So there we are. So you and me are right up here. And great. So our first one is, wow, very relevant, very to the point. How can we determine which employees to bring back to the office?
Yeah, so the general best practice here is to determine the essentialness of that role versus any kind of subjective factors such as productivity, right? So, if somebody wasn't as productive while they're working from home, just saying that that is a reason you want them in the office may not be effective. Best practice here again is to focus on the essentialness. Is this somebody who has to be in the office for face-to-face meetings? Is this somebody who, for instance, a manager of a sales team might need to be there for their team or something like that. So just keep in mind that it really should, at least at this point in the return to work, is the essentialness piece.
That's great. Thank you, Kara.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
We did touch on common spaces in buildings with multiple tenants. This question deals with bathrooms specifically, i.e. sharing a common bathroom with other tenants on your floor. Did you have anything to add or supplement with what we spoke about?
Mostly just want to reiterate that it's important to work with your building on this specific topic because they may have specific rules about social distancing or hand washing that you may not have considered. So definitely check with your building, figure out what's going on there. And even if you're sharing with other tenants on the floor, you can always check with their office managers on what their policies are as well.
Great. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really like this question. If an employee is infected, do we have to notify OSHA?
So generally speaking, this is an industry-based question. If you're in an industry that is required to record occupational injuries and illnesses on a form called the OSHA Form 300, which sounds very bureaucratic, then this could be a work-related illness if somebody was to catch it in the office space. If you are a covered employee in which you have to document any kind of work-related illness on this form, you should definitely assess the case and obviously consult with your counsel, because they'll definitely tell you like which way to go. But yeah, so if you are a covered employee who has to fill out this form, I would definitely check case by case basis. But otherwise, probably not. Probably, you should, whatever your internal procedures for any kind of injury or something like that, follow that. But as far as like notifying OSHA and telling them what happened, probably not. But always check with counsel if necessary, and if you're concerned. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Very, very comprehensive answer. Great. Our attendee, Jeremy Cohen, has a great question that's two-part. I'm going to field the first part, Kara, and then I'd love for you to field the second half of it. Do we need to have waivers for patients and employees to sign as they enter into an area, stating that they are there voluntarily and as to what their temperature is? So thanks for that question, Jeremy. I'm seeing patients and employees, so maybe you're writing this from the perspective of a medical office or where patients are seen. So it's very complicated, and the answer is maybe, but maybe not. So OSHA has released some prevailing guidance with respect to waivers generally, in that they're not looked upon super favorably because of what's called like unequal bargaining power. And since the employer is the party with greater authority and control, it can sort of be looked at that this agreement might be entered into not on a level playing field, right? So these things have been difficult in the past to implement and to enforce, especially if the workplace is like not taking sufficient precautions to protect employees from potentially contracting COVID-19. So that might be a consideration. Anyway, waivers are really complicated. Definitely check with your counsel, with an attorney before implementing this with your employees and with patients, and that goes for customers as well. So it really depends. If an employee contracts COVID at work, they very well might qualify for workers' comp, which there are laws that govern that as well. So it's very tricky. I think the underlying theme of this webinar is to implement some of these precautions, and then when it goes to reducing employer liability through like written documents, run those past counsel. Kara, the part that intrigued me that you might want to speak to is letting us know what their temperature is. So that made me think of like self-checks and any alternatives to employers actually taking temperatures on site.
Yeah, so self-checking, it really, again, this is up to your policy and what you decide to do. You can offer self-check, but again, the most important piece here is how you're documenting that information. If an employee provides you that information, are you going to store it, or are it really depends if you're collecting that information to keep a record of it. If they self-check at home before they come in, who's to say that they won't have a fever by the time they get to the office, right? So those are things to consider. It's, again, there's no requirement to do either in that way, but you may want to implement maybe a symptom check and then a temperature check at the office, something like that. Those are options, yeah.
Thank you. Talia Kula has a question on common spaces. Are there any recommendations for ensuring that folks have access to water, given the recommendation to restrict access to kitchens?
That is a great question. If there's no rule on faucets and things like that, so I would still consider having access to water being an important office aspect. Just make sure that there are cleaning supplies near that area where people might be touching surfaces. I have heard that some vendors out there are water vendors that do like seltzer and things like that. They've created an app to do like digital water dispensing. So that might be something cool to look at for your office if that's available to you. But as far as, having faucets and access to water, that is important. I would say have cleaning supplies nearby. Make sure that everybody's trained to clean that area once it's complete.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it might be a situation, depending on how open your kitchen is, where it's like one person in at a time, and the only thing you can do is fetch water. Make sure to sanitize the faucet when you leave, and then depart that portion of the office.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually heard there is a water cooler company that is developing a touchless app where you can turn it on. You like hook it up to the internet and you turn it on with your phone. I don't know, pretty high tech, but that's cool ideas coming out of this. Anonymous is asking, don't individual states have their own workplace safety requirements in addition to federal OSHA?
Yes. So there are a lot of states with their own requirements. New York is one, just because that's on my mind all the time.
Mhm.
Right now we're in phase 2 in New York City, but other places in New York. It also could be regional. It could be different parts of the state. So it's definitely important to check with your state guidance, wherever that might be, and also check with your legal counsel, because some states are requiring a full-on plan that you have in your own record. So that should be checked by legal counsel to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements.
Great, thank you so much. For the benefit of our attendees, there are so many questions coming through about temperature checks. That does seem to be one of the hot questions. Luckily, tomorrow, I want to reiterate, we are hosting another Ask an Expert webinar with our valued partner, One Medical. And they're going to talk all about temperature checks, the mechanisms related to those, how you might implement technology in order to facilitate temperature checks. So we're really going to get in depth about that tomorrow. Really encourage you to attend. It's at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, and you can view that on our events page at justworks.com. So Kara, I want to respect your time. Looks like we're right at time here. I can't thank you enough for your expertise and for the just letting us benefit from your expertise today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Moses. I really liked our conversation today.
Certainly, me too. Well, no doubt I will talk to you soon. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us. Be well, be safe, and have a great rest of your day.